You know, it's always great when a Chicago company comes down and makes a difference, and in this case, Northern Trust. Sabrina, come on down and tell us the Northern Trust story.
So there's positives and negatives to speaking later on in the day. So on a negative note, many of the speakers have covered a lot of the material I was looking to speak about. Hint, hint, Matt Morellis, IBM. On a positive note, I can share a broader perspective on Northern Trust and what we're looking at from a business innovation perspective. So just to introduce myself, I'm Sabrina Smith. I work in the market advocacy and innovation research team at Northern Trust, and we're a team that supports our business leadership in terms of assessing innovation and disruption arising from emerging technologies such as the blockchain. Before I jump into my presentation, can I just ask for one show of hands? Does everyone here understand or know what a global custodian bank does? Can you, it's a bit loud, sorry. Does everyone know what a global custodian bank is and what we do within the financial services market? No? Okay, good. So I can explain it. So Northern Trust is a global custodian. We support wealth management clients, asset management clients, and institutional investor clients in terms of providing safe custody and servicing their securities investments across over 102 markets. We manage 7.1 trillion in assets under custody, and we enable the full spectrum of asset servicing. So from security settlement through to asset servicing activities such as income collection, corporate actions. We provide consolidated reporting across those investments, and we also provide value-added services such as valuations and accounting and securities lending. So that's very much at a very high level what we do as a global custodian. And today I'm here to just talk to you about some of the innovation and research that we've conducted, and also the launch of our private equity product. So just to recap on some of the themes that we've heard in today's presentations throughout the day. To take a very high-level view, within the securities market today, there's central banks and central securities depositories that act as the sole record of truth within the markets. So those entities are responsible for maintaining the books and records. So who owns what securities, what transactions have occurred. The markets are supported by intermediaries, trusted intermediaries, that provide access and settlement and asset servicing type activities for end investors. From a market perspective, some of the challenges are in terms of transactional friction. So there's multiple parties involved, multiple handoffs. There's the chance for transactional information to be relayed in an inaccurate way, create friction points where manual intervention and operations staff might need to intervene. There's also a central point of failure. So central banks and CSDs acting as the sole source of information, the sole books and records for the markets, are a central point of potential failure if for example, there's any issues with the settlement ecosystem there. When we look at the blockchain and the opportunity to enable other types of business models, we're really looking at how can the blockchain be leveraged to create ecosystems where multiple participants can transact and interact on a common ledger and rely on the information that they have as being the sole source of truth. So back to some of the challenges with how things work today, where we have multiple institutions relying on trusted intermediaries and transacting and passing on transactional information, there's the chance for books and records to fall out of sync. So banks today, custodian banks, other types of financial institutions have to perform something called reconciliations, and that's basically checking what I have on my system agrees with what you've got on your system. And where there's reconciliation breaks, there's activities and investigations involved in resolving those breaks. So where we see a blockchain-based intermediary model, that where multiple parties can transact and leverage a replicated ledger and rely on their version of the information, the books and records for securities and cash and other types of transactional information being accurate, it removes this requirement to constantly check and validate information throughout the chains with those parties. So within the financial services industry, we're exploring opportunities to leverage the blockchain technology, but from a private perspective. So financial firms getting together and creating closed, private or semi-private ecosystems where they can transact together. When I say semi-private, I'm referring to the ability to perhaps permission certain stakeholders in the ecosystem to view all or part of the information maintained. So those type of stakeholders could be regulators or auditors or other types of service providers. Okay, so when we look at the financial services industry and from a custodian bank perspective, there's a number of areas where the blockchain technology could offer innovation or potentially disruption. And we've heard about a lot of these areas in the presentations earlier, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on them. But first of all, if we look at the concept of digital identification. So, as we heard in earlier presentations, this is creating an ability for an individual, a legal entity, or a sovereign entity to establish a digital record where they own their information. And they have full autonomy to permission certain service providers or other stakeholders to access parts of their identity records. So in financial services today, KYC, customer onboarding, is a very challenging process that can be quite manual, and it's replicated across multiple firms. In the blockchain potentially enabled digital identity framework, that can perhaps create some efficiencies and different methods of onboarding clients onto financial services products. So a couple of examples of activities within the industry at the moment. The Japanese regulator is working with 5 of the leading Japanese banks to establish an identity framework where those banks can leverage an identity platform as part of a customer onboarding process and be permissioned to access certain components of that identity record. If we look at asset issuance and custody, so we've talked about digital assets and different types of assets that could potentially be issued in public blockchains. From a private blockchain and financial services perspective, there's the potential to issue perhaps listed securities, or also securities that haven't been issued historically in a digital form, such as alternative assets. So there's been activities in the industry within the gold market. So Euroclear and Paxos, previously called ItBit, have collaborated on exploring opportunities from a gold perspective. I'll talk shortly about what Northern Trust has done from the private equity perspective, and other types of asset classes may potentially be recorded and issued in a digital form. In terms of some of the industry examples, the state of Delaware have actually changed their law to introduce the concept of incorporating companies on a blockchain-based ecosystem. So there's a lot of activity and research at the moment in terms of concepts around issuing assets digitally. In terms of executing transactions, the real key here is looking at new ways of transacting between counterparts. So some of you may be aware that Barclays have collaborated and done an initial pilot around leveraging the blockchain and smart contracts in particular for ISDA agreements. So these are traded ISDA agreements and actually leveraging a concept called oracles to feed in external information such as pricing and valuations as such. So if we look at the other components, so once you've executed a transaction, settling a transaction. So transactions are typically settled at either central securities depositories or central banks. Today, where those entities maintain the overall books and records of events and ownership. In the future, those transactions could potentially be settled on blockchain-enabled ecosystems. So some of you may be aware that in Australia, the Australian Stock Exchange, which is actually the entity that managed the CHESS settlement system, so that's the settlement system that managed the settlement activity and issuance for the Australian market in terms of equities and bonds. They've commissioned Digital Asset Holdings to help them work through a business case for potentially leveraging a blockchain-enabled ecosystem for replacement of that legacy platform. And there's other examples where central market infrastructures, whether they be central banks or central CSDs have initiated research pilots and proof of concepts to assess the business case associated with blockchain-enabled technology. So we look at asset servicing and shareholder servicing. An area of particular interest in the industry is looking at opportunities to leverage the blockchain for proxy voting. So this is where a company is holding either an annual general meeting or an exceptional general meeting, and they need to engage with the shareholders in order to vote on particular resolutions. So an example of blockchain innovation in the proxy voting area is the pilot that Northern Trust did with Broadridge. So Broadridge is a service provider that provide proxy services to multiple organisations and investors, and we've partnered with them, Santander and JP Morgan, on an initial pilot to evidence whether the blockchain could be used to enable vote transparency during the course of a proxy meeting. So that's looking at a particular event that's upcoming and tracking how the market's moving in terms of voting in relation to that particular event. And then once we get to a position where we have securities issued and we have transactions and settlement of activity within the blockchain, there's potential for regulators, as I mentioned, to be permission to access certain information, so to increase the delivery of information to the regulator, and that could perhaps create efficiencies in terms of reporting obligations and increased transparency. There's also the potential to eliminate some of the more onerous tasks that we have within the securities industry on data and constantly having to verify data and validate data across multiple sources. So if the information is available in an immutable form as a golden record, that could perhaps create some efficiencies in terms of a data environment. Okay, so what could the new financial services ecosystem look like? So just to highlight some of the key aspects of this slide, the entities highlighted as grey we see as potentially being disrupted and potentially having to evolve their business models in the future. So those entities may see some degree of either vertical or horizontal integration and collaboration in terms of assessing and implementing new blockchain-enabled ecosystems. And what could the future look like in terms of Northern Trust? So just to highlight some of the areas on this slide, we see our role as a global custodian, enabling clients access into various marketplaces as being still valid in the future. So in the future, we may be providing access into blockchain-enabled ecosystems, servicing assets that have been potentially issued on those ecosystems and digitally. And just to highlight some of the key aspects of our private equity solution, we've actually gone live in the market with a production blockchain for the private equity market. And this is the private equity fund administration market. So we've partnered with IBM and other stakeholders, the local Guernsey regulator, audit firms and a asset manager that we service to establish a blockchain-based environment to support the end-to-end life cycle of a private equity fund. So we're still building out capability with that ecosystem, but we're live, we're in production, and we're aiming to enable the full end-to-end life cycle from establishing legals, recording investors in the fund register, and supporting income and capital distributions. So I'm conscious of the time. So is there any questions before I move on? Yep. So I think the question was, have we realised any cost savings? And the answer is not yet. But from the perspective of Northern Trust, one thing it's important to highlight, we're actually looking at implementing live production-ready solutions now. So we're beyond proof of concepts and experimentation with the blockchain. We know it works. We're just looking for those business cases that evidence the return on investment. So from our private equity solution, we envisage that we can potentially automate up to 30% of the PE process. Any other questions? Yep, at the back. Sorry. Yes, this is a private ecosystem with permissioned parties. So we can provide the regulator with access to information they require, the investment manager, the investors, and any other stakeholders, but it is a private ecosystem. Just at the front. So at the moment, from a client perspective for Northern Trust, our clients are really trying to understand what the blockchain is. For many of our clients, they've heard about it in the press, they've read it online, and they're really trying to understand what the impacts are to them and things that where the benefits are. So we're starting to speak a lot more to clients about the potential and the value of the blockchain. And as we progress, I'm sure there'll be more clients that have more of an active role and more progressive in terms of looking at the opportunities. So.
Thank you, Sabrina. How about
Thank you.